right, I will start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Social Workers Confronting Racial Justice Conference. You are here for your first presentation. I am Eve Ferguson, a proud social worker and adjunct faculty at the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm delighted that you are all joining us for this breakout presentation called Healing from Within, providing survivor-led, advocacy-driven, and culturally specific care to American Indian women survivors of violence. Before we begin, I will again share the acknowledgement of the land we are occupying that is now known as Madison, Wisconsin, and invite each of you to do the same wherever you are, because every single one of us occupies sacred ancestral land of indigenous nations. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dijope since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state governments repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. And today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. So this presentation is going to be recorded for you and will be available on our conference website at a later date. Before I introduce our speakers, here's a couple of housekeeping items. To access this presentation, you are required to provide your name and email, because this allows us to log in you as attendees and email you information on CEUs for this presentation, which will be distributed via email at a later date as well. So for your information, your cameras and microphones will all remain muted, and the chat function has been deactivated because of the large number of folks attending. We do have a Q&A feature though, where you can submit questions for our presenter if you wish. Please know that due to the large volume of attendees, we will most likely not be able to get all the questions you'll submit, but thank you so much for your effort and thoughtfulness in framing your questions. And now it is my honor to introduce our presenters, two wonderful women. We have Dr. Janil Luebke, PhD, RN, who is a postdoc nurse research associate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is an enrolled member of the Bad River Band of Lake Superior Chippewa Indians. She received her early nursing degrees, her LPN and ADN, in Bemidji, Minnesota, her BS and MS in nursing from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and her PhD at UW-Milwaukee. Her area of research and expertise include intimate partner violence in the lives of American Indian women, community health nursing, and utilization and application of post-colonial and indigenous feminist methodologies. She is a survivor of intimate partner violence and is passionate about sharing her knowledge and personal experiences to help to support and empower other women to transition to survivorhood. We also have Barbara Blackdear Mackenzie, Ho-Chunk Nation member. She's the Community Advocate Resource and Emotional Support Director and Community Healer for HIR Wellness Institute. She was recently asked to work on the Wisconsin Department of Justice Missing and Murdered Indigenous Task Force Legislative and Policy Work Group. She provides professional development on the following topics: Indigenous First Nations, Native American people, and tribal nations, teachings of the medicine wheel, Sea Thunder, mending broken hearts, mothers of tradition, survivors of suicide, homicide, and genocide through White Bison Incorporated, pan-tribal attitudes, trauma-informed care, historic and intergenerational trauma, community resilience, bias, stereotyping, and prejudice, recovering at-risk youth, physical and sexual violence, sex trafficking, and advocacy work. Pre-COVID, Barbara worked for Ho-Chunk Nation Social Services and was board president for HIR Wisconsin. Please welcome Dr. Luebke and Ms. Blackdear Mackenzie.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. The title of our presentation workshop is Healing from Within. And on this slide, you will see a part of a jingle dress. And I just wanted to point out that the jingle dress is a piece of Indigenous culture. It's a dress that's worn during ceremony, dancing, to bring healing to individuals and families and communities who are in need. There are little metal tins that hang from the dress from about 1 inch, and when you dance, they cling together and they make noises. And so with every step of the dance, that collective noise is heard, and it's every step is a prayer to the creator and a step towards healing. So I just wanted to point out why we have a photo of that at the beginning of our presentation, just to highlight a piece of our culture and ways in which you know, we work to heal ourselves and our people. Oops. Okay. Okay, there we go.
This is our land acknowledgement. Welcome to Deshishik, which is Milwaukee, Dejop, which is Madison, and Neohuani, Black River Falls, which is where I'm located, and all parts of what we now know as Wisconsin. Currently, this area is also home to no fewer than 12 tribes, 11 of which are federally recognized. Occupation of what is now Wisconsin started around 1600 with the northern bands of Ojibwa having first local contact with Jeneile. Between 1776 and 1872, the treaties were made by the United States and Native nations, and the tribes of Wisconsin were forced to cede these lands, as you heard in the land acknowledgement by Jean earlier. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the tribes from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Next. The terminology. We're committed to using terminology that respects and honors the individuals to whom this presentation refers. Currently, there are over 570 federally recognized American Indian and Alaskan Native Indian tribes in the U.S. While no single term is universally accepted by all Indigenous peoples in the United States, the terms American Indian, Alaskan Native, Indigenous, and Native American are used for data and reporting purposes only and appear in the form of the terminology was originally published. It's not meant to minimize, exclude, or generalize the individuals involved, nor endorse one form of terminology over another. Next. Do you want to do our learning objectives?
Sure.
Today?
So our learning objectives for this workshop are really to share our knowledge and our experience and in helping others to recognize that intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and trafficking occur disproportionately against Indigenous peoples. They're often intertwined and very kind of an complex topic to unpack. So that's what we're gonna do today. We're also gonna go through some of the history regarding Indigenous peoples of Wisconsin and through this intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, and also resilience. We're gonna discuss how identity shapes our experience in how we care for intimate partner violence and sexual assault survivors as social workers, nurses, and other allied health professionals. And then also suggesting to improve systems and engagement in how to care with Indigenous people in our work.
Okay, here's our pre-test. This is just for you to reflect. We're not actually quizzing you, but our number one is to name the 12 tribes of Wisconsin. Just in your head, can you think of any? Number two, how many language groups of the tribes in Wisconsin are there? And number 3, of the 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, how many are tribally created or native-centered domestic violence shelters are there? Next. Okay, question 1, the answer is 12 tribes. Our federally recognized tribes include Bad River Band, Ho-Chunk Nation, Lakota Ray Band, Lac du Flambeau Band, Menominee Tribe, Oneida Nation, Forest County Potawatomi, Red Cliff Band, St. Croix Chippewa, Saucoggan Chippewa, Lethbridge Munsee, and one non-federally recognized tribe, the Brotherton. Next. And question 2 is how many language groups are there? The answer is 7. There are the Chippewa language groups with Red Cliff, Bad River, St. Croix, Lakota Ray, Lac du Flambeau, and Mole Lake. 2 is Ho-Chunk, 3 Menominee, 4 Potawatomi, 5 Oneida, 6 Mohegan, and 7 is Mohawk. And question 3, of the 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, how many tribally created or native-centered domestic violence shelters are there? The answer is less than 60.
Thanks, Barbara, for doing our quiz. Hopefully everyone got several of those right. And if not, then hopefully you were able to learn a little bit more than you did before. So the first part of this workshop, we're really going to cover some background material. So recognizing how intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and trafficking occur disproportionately against Indigenous peoples in Wisconsin. So we'll review a little bit of incidence and prevalence and some definitions just so we can understand a little bit better about what's going on. So thinking about gender-based violence, this is one of the most serious public health issues occurring in American Indian communities today. So that includes Alaskan Natives and American Indians in the United States. But it's also something that impacts Indigenous communities throughout the world as well. So our neighbors to the north in Canada, South America, Central America, New Zealand, that this is something that impacts all Indigenous communities. Violence against American Indian women is greatest among American Indians more than any other racially defined group. So in a national survey that surveyed around 4,000 American Indians, almost 84.3% had experienced lifetime violence. This includes physical, sexual, emotional. American Indian men are also highly susceptible to violence. Almost 82% of American Indian men reported lifetime violence, mostly emotional and verbal. Homicide is also a very high risk. Almost 10 times the national average of homicide occurs on some of our reservations in the United States. We're also at very high risk for sexually transmitted infections and HIV transmission through this intersection of sexual assault and trafficking. Transgender and two-spirit people are also at very high or disproportionate risk for violence. The data is lacking in this area, but some studies, we have found that 82% of women of color, mostly younger and in the South, have been victims of homicide that are transgender. So really things that we want to highlight about gender-based violence is that it's negatively impacting our people. It's a silent epidemic. We know that it's often underreported or unreported, and that there are major implications to our health and our well-being Aside from the obvious physical injuries, homicide or death, we also experience mental health issues, PTSD. There's often drug or alcohol misuse to cope. There may be eating disorders, sleep disturbances, decreased productivity with work and school. So one thing to highlight about some of these statistics is that this is not a new phenomenon. So although some of these statistics are recent, this is not something that's new. This has been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years since the earliest colonial contact. It's gaining more attention now. It's being recognized as an injustice, largely due to the work that Indigenous women, men, families, and communities have been doing all along. These grassroots efforts and activists within communities have really come a long way in gaining a lot of national attention and getting airtime and publications on this. So the work that we are doing as Indigenous activists, Barbara and I we're just building on the foundation that has already been built by activists and their families. Indigenous peoples are also at high risk for human trafficking. We know in large urban areas such as Milwaukee that trafficking is a major issue. It's often unreported or underreported. In fact, over the past 4 years, Milwaukee is consistently ranked among the top 5 cities in the United States for the recovery of trafficking adolescents. Many of the trafficking victims are minors. We've seen victims as young as 12 or younger who've been recovered. Indigenous peoples are often at high risk or are victims of trafficking. There's a intersection between intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and trafficking that occurs where they're often commingled and happening simultaneously. Oftentimes, victims of trafficking don't see themselves as being trafficked. They're often groomed, or they become intertwined in romantic relationships with the perpetrator, and it happens very slowly and insidiously. And oftentimes the survivor will defend or lie for the trafficker. There's often that trauma bonding that happens. So it becomes very complex to recognize and intervene sometimes with cases of human trafficking. So missing and murdered Indigenous people, you may have seen MMIW for missing and murdered Indigenous women. There's various acronyms, and for the sake of this presentation, we are using MMIP just to be inclusive of women, girls, men, two-spirit, transgender. So again, this is something that's gaining momentum, gaining a lot of awareness. And this again is really, this is the voices of Indigenous people that have raised awareness through uniting together. This is something, again, that happens in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the United States, something that happens globally. We know that it's a huge issue here in the United States. We do not know the exact numbers of the missing and murdered Indigenous people. There is not one single database in the United States that is logging this information. We do know that in 2016, there were 5,712 reports of missing Indigenous women or girls in the United States. That doesn't mean that there were actually that many that were missing or murdered. but that's the reports of people gone missing. Some of them were recovered. Sometimes people are reported missing more than once in a year. But what is really problematic is that the NAMUS database through the Department of Justice only logged 116 of those 5,702 cases. So this is a really big problem. There's a lot of reasons that we'll discuss in upcoming slides about jurisdictional confusion and misclassification of race, racism, mismanagement of cases, incompetent staffing. So there are a lot of different reasons, but I'd mentioned previously that on certain reservations, we know that Indigenous people have been murdered at 10 times the national average. And in states like Montana, where Indigenous citizens represent about 6.5% of their population, but yet they accounted for 26% of the state's missing persons cases. So this is something that impacts different parts of the country more than others, but it is something that is a huge, huge problem. It's estimated that if we went back to 1900s and we could account for every case of a missing or murdered Indigenous person, that those cases would probably be closer to 20,000 today. So Barbara.
Okay, learning objective 2, identifying how we got here, some history regarding the Indigenous people of Wisconsin, trauma, historical trauma, and resilience. Next.
I have to use my cursor, sorry.
So what happened? Frequency, duration, and succession of historical trauma periods. Now, if we took this backwards, start at the bottom of the slide, we're talking about a lot of grief, loss, and trauma. So just the most recent have been, inadequate policies, urban relocation policies from 1950s to the 1970s, then termination prior to that from 1954 to 1970, the boarding schools from 1879 to 1973, land cession from 1492 on, starting in the eastern part of the United States and going all the way to the Pacific Ocean, land cession from 1492 on, ongoing racism from 1492 on, and colonization from 1492 on. Now you look at this succession and you can see that one thing after another is piling on top of each other. And I look at that in terms of what's happened to us, not only in our DNA, but also our epigenetics and social transmission. Next. So genocide defined according to the Convention for Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, that was adopted in the United Nations after World War II, which is oftentimes why in our public schools, what happened with Native Americans and Indigenous people in North America is not often referred to as ongoing genocide. And yet, from pre-contact to 1900, it's estimated that 99% of the Indigenous population was decimated from the US and Canada. What's left are the descendants of those survivors. Next. Boarding schools happen to be one of the more insidious forms of the socialization and transmission. The basic outcomes and dynamics from it were that the children that attended boarding school learned the main messages of don't talk, don't feel, don't tell, and don't trust. And with that, it was compounded with a different religion, which in this case is Christianity. So there was introduction of the concepts of blame, shame, and guilt. People who had gone to boarding school for any length of time were not easily accepted back home. So if they went to boarding school from, say, their first grade up till 8th grade, they had missed literally 8 years of what it was to be socialized within their tribes. And with those 8 years, there's a lot of learning that takes place when you're thinking about a parent who's, a child's very first teacher, and then the fact that the community was involved in that child's learning and how intense that particular process is in terms of acculturating a person. So when the children were removed from that environment, and they were literally stolen in the beginning, then what happened was a true genocide of their knowledge, their history, their beliefs, punishment toward speaking their language. And in addition to that, the socialization process, the order of the school was maintained so that they were by chronological age. The people who attended boarding school were not parented. They were told to stay in their lines, stay in their age group. And so they couldn't look in on younger siblings, which was a natural way to teach how to parent. So when they graduated from the boarding schools or escaped or so on, they didn't know how to parent. They didn't know necessarily how to say, I love you. They didn't necessarily know to hug a person in order to comfort them or nurture them. And over the years, these issues resulted in many first language native speakers dying without ever passing their native languages along to the next generation. And why is language such a big concern to us? The language contains our stories, our songs, poetry, and our values and worldviews. And many believe that our language is given to us by the Creator and that the words are sacred. Next. So with the assimilation dynamics, understand that through time, fewer primary sources of information, such as elders passing, and then the inclusion of stereotypical information growing and growing from a diversified and stratified media, resulted in basically identity crises for our young people now. And it's continuing. So if you look at the left hand of the graphics, we started in 1700. What was there? It was books and newspapers. In 1800, we were talking about radio. 1900, television. The 1980s, we start to look at the 24-hour news, cable TV channels, and that type of thing. So the stereotypical knowledge and influence over our young people increased through time. With the traditional knowledge, however, at first it was a lot, and we didn't, our ancestors didn't necessarily perceive the threat. What they did see, though, is that through time, the numbers of elders and the amount of traditional knowledge that was passed along grew to less and less. I mean, it just absolutely, it's to the point where some tribes have none of their language left. It doesn't even exist within phonetic histories. So there's a lot of concern among the tribes in terms of how to increase tribal knowledge through tribal voices who still have knowledge, and it constantly runs against this generational time clock. Next. So in closing of this section, settler colonialism are the origins of violence. The high rates of violence are deeply intertwined in the history of colonization and socio-political contexts. The colonization and forced assimilation had their impacts. Termination policies of different tribes and losing their reservation status and their tribal status, creation of reservations, land dispossession, and boarding schools all had their impacts. Understand that over 1.25 billion acres during this time frame between about 1800 to 1870 was lost by Native people, 1.25 billion. So with the loss of culture, language, kinship, and ways of life, specifically connecting to the land, historic racism, discrimination, exclusion, and marginalization continued to take place. Then we add into it the centuries of sexual violence that started during the colonial times, and the origins of trafficking were also from that basis. The harmful assumptions and stereotypes of American Indians have continued to make this process even harder on Native American people. So it's with that that we go to our next objective. Next.
Okay, so objective 3 is taking this a little bit further and kind of unpacking some of these layers and discussing how we may have not been meeting the needs of Indigenous people just due to the nature of our education systems and how we have learned as we've gone through our programs. So looking at this a little bit, kind of zooming out, talking about overlapping and intersecting systems of oppression. So this is plugging in some of the things that Barbara has discussed about the origins of violence. And as practitioners, we really need to have an understanding of how all of these different systems intersect together and understand why the rates of violence are as high as they are. We look at some of those economic and environmental policies. I'll talk a little bit about environmental policies next. But we also have tensions with law enforcement, high rates of incarceration for American Indians. We have issues of jurisdiction and sovereignty that add a lot of complication to the criminal justice aspect of it. We have that historical trauma and a lot of deep distrust of healthcare and social service agencies. There's barriers to seeking or receiving help. There's underfunding of federal Indian Health Service agencies. So all of these things really kind of overlap and intertwine and build on one another. And that's where we're seeing a lot of the manifestations still today. And one thing to really point out and realize that violence, interpersonal violence in relationships is not a traditional Native American value. Women and Native American people have always, we've highly respected each other, and we have we have a clan system and kinship systems, and there's a role and a purpose within our tribes, and women have been highly valued and highly respected and prized. Many tribes were matrilineal. Native American women have held high positions of power and even fought alongside men in battle. So violence did not, it's not that it wasn't ever, it did never exist, but if it did, it was dealt with swiftly and by means of restorative justice. A lot of the violence between Native Americans that we see today, especially in interpersonal relationships, is not reflective of traditional ways or values. It's really due to an influence of patriarchy and subtler colonial influence. So that's one thing I do want to highlight, is that is not something that's reflective of our traditional ways. Some of the contemporary forms of oppression that we still see today that are happening, again, this is building upon other systems of oppression. I mentioned a few of these before, but some of the bigger things that we're seeing are our energy and economic policies, fossil fuel extraction, land degradation. We have mining, damming, fracking, we have pipelines. Those have caused a lot of damage to Indigenous communities, There's an influx of temporary workers who come into these areas, often very small, close-knit indigenous communities. And then we have thousands of workers coming into these areas, and there's often increases of violence that happen. There is sex trading that happens, there's trafficking, there's intimate partner violence, sexual assaults, drug and alcohol misuse. So these economic policies that have really kind of opened the floodgates for disruption of the way that our communities have been structured and the way that people have been living. Some other contemporary issues that we've seen is state foster care systems. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, which was put in place to address the high rates of foster care, or children that ended up in foster care who were taken away from their parents, something that actually my family was impacted by. Forced sterilization in the 1970s. This was done by Indian healthcare service workers. We know that Indian health service providers were complicit in forced sterilization through coercion, or just they would go in for an appendectomy and come out with a bonus hysterectomy. Oftentimes the consent process was not done with dignity or respect. And these are things that American Indian peoples still remember. I mean, that wasn't that long ago. So there's also issues with our criminal justice system that have not protected our survivors of violence. Our mandatory arrest laws and issues with if someone has a warrant out for their arrest and there's an incidence of violence and police have been called and women have or men have been arrested simply because they had a warrant out, even though they had visible injuries. There's many layers in contemporary forms of oppression that are still happening today that are really responsible for some of the perpetuation of these high rates of violence. This is just a quick, this is just to give you an idea of the criminal justice system and our federal policies that really highlight how complex the tribal jurisdiction is. And we have federal policies that are in place and have been put in place since the 1800s, but some of them as recent as 1978 that have really prevented or stripped the inherent right for tribes to self-govern or to be able to arrest or detain or prosecute perpetrators of violence for crimes that happen in tribal areas. So there's this algorithm that looks at the race of the offender, the race of the victim, whether it happened in a public law 280 state, if it's on a reservation or not. And you can see how easily sometimes things can become confused and how things slip through the cracks. So this is just kind of to highlight and give you an idea of the complexities that exist between the tribes that are considered individual sovereign nations within our states. and how there's a nation-to-nation relationship between the tribes and the federal government. Wisconsin is one of 7 states that is a public law 280 state, and that adds a little bit of confusion, because that basically says that the state of Wisconsin takes over in some of these prosecutions instead of the federal government. There are exceptions, like the Menominee Nation is one of the tribes in Wisconsin that is exempt from public law 280. So, you know, little rules like that often add layers of confusion. So thinking about these intersecting systems and structural barriers, thinking about as providers, whether it's nurses, social workers, allied professionals, advocates, things that we may do to inadvertently create barriers to care for survivors. So here, and these are things that either we've seen in practice or have been shared by survivors of violence through the research that I've done. And I've also drawn from the book Violence of Care, which we have in our reference list. So some of the biggest mistakes that we've seen is invalidating the experiences of the survivors, having a paternalistic attitude where we think we know what's best for them, inadvertently victim shaming or blaming, ignoring the needs for safety, not respecting autonomy or self-sovereignty, which is that ability to be the experts in our own care, trivializing or minimizing the abuse, missing opportunities to screen for violence, and missing opportunities to provide resources. So really, sometimes we have been complicit in not meeting these needs, and this is just a time to kind of reflect on some of these mistakes and think about how we can prevent that going forward. So really having a survivor not believed about what happened, or us acknowledging the injustice that happened, really will shut that trust relationship down very, very quickly. We really have to take all reports of violence very seriously and acknowledge the injustice that's happened. Let's see, I have a couple of quotes from survivors that have talked about these experiences. These are pseudonyms for some of the research participants, but they say, let us know that we're safe. Try to get us away from the abuser, even if they may be sitting outside. One participant shared that she tried going to see a counselor, and it wasn't a good experience for her, because she felt that she wasn't being heard, that there weren't understandings about the way that she lived intergenerationally with her mom and her sister, and she felt shamed, or ashamed that there was no attempt to understand the way that she lived. The quotes were, "You're 26, why don't you just go out and get your own apartment and let them deal with what they have going on?" So there was just that lack of understanding about kinship and culture. There were a number of survivors who were turned away from shelters because they had been drinking, and it was felt that they didn't meet the criteria to be able to stay at the shelter. A number of survivors said that they felt like they were treated like they didn't matter, or they weren't believed. And we know that there are many coexisting issues with survivors of violence, whether it's substance abuse or misuse, entanglements with law enforcement. There could be mental health issues going on. So, not having an understanding of that, historical perspective and that historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, and it's really created barriers for survivors to get the care that they need and deserve. So we know that women of color are more reluctant to seek help after experiences of violence, and that includes American Indian women. The study that I did this spring, I did in-depth individual qualitative interviews, and the women that I had connected with and interviewed, 2/3 of them did not seek help after experiences of violence, regardless of injuries, some of which were very significant. There were many reasons that were personal and structural, geographic, but we also need to keep in mind too that silence is often a trauma response as well. Voices have been silenced for centuries, and that's still true today. So there's also a lack of culturally specific resources available. We have a shortage or a lack of sexual assault nurse examiners and culturally specific advocates in urban and in rural areas. Oops. Cursor, here we go. There are also learned social practices, which we had mentioned previously as well. There's dominant social norms that really facilitate the dismissal of experiences of violence, including sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and trafficking by ethnic minority women. We do this through justification of racism and sexism. We learn it through social practices. We assume it is truth. And these are embedded into our policies and our interventions. I mentioned previously, some of those policies are, inclusion criteria for why a survivor may or may not be able to stay at a shelter. So we create barriers through these beliefs or assumptions that, someone is non-compliant, or somebody is lying, or they're not, they don't model the perfect victim or survivor. And really, these learned social practices impact access to healthcare or other services, or shelter, social services, et cetera, following experiences of violence.
Janil, can I add to that?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we also see is a difference between county and tribal service systems, where there's an assumption oftentimes that, oh, well, the tribe's going to take care of that person.
Thank you.
And that may or may not be true. Yes, ultimately, we're going to take care of our people, but the way it's supposed to work is a dovetail where because we're citizens of the United States and in states and counties and paying taxes like everyone else, there's that concept that we are supposed to first get the county resources and then move up from there. And then the tribal pieces are enhancements. So in that sense, there's oftentimes this misnomer that we take it, from the very same point that a county would, and that's simply not true.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And some of that too is also coincides with the geographic barriers. Oftentimes, as we saw on the map at the beginning, tribes are located, many of the reservation-based areas are in northern Wisconsin and maybe in remote areas. There's often hundreds of thousands of uninhabited acres on a reservation, and it can be hours, 2 to 3 hours to the nearest hospital or domestic violence shelter. So it is often assumed that tribes will take care of it, but the resources that tribes can offer are often very limited too. So, and again, just to kind of circle back, why this matters is we talk about these things and acknowledge these things because we want to minimize and eliminate these barriers to care. And in order to eliminate barriers, we need to understand them and how they relate to systemic oppression. And we really need to do a better job of acknowledging that women who or men, people who experience violence are the experts in what they need in terms of interventions, and listening, centering the survivors' voices of violence really is the key to recognizing that those who are experiencing violence are the experts in what they need and can help us to create survivor-led interventions that will better serve victims and survivors. So in essence, we're trying to prevent the replication of oppression, improve care, and then ultimately prevent injury and death.
So learning objective 3, recall how identity shapes the experience and care for intimate partner violence and sexual assault survivors. Next. So I guess one of the things that I find is very important is for our audience to understand what was there before. Traditional indigenous worldview, pre-colonial ways were such that they were the tribes, our ancestors, were fully developed civilizations with complex language, trade routes, even pharmacology that ran between North and South America. And so in that sense, it was an advanced civilization. It might not have been the same as European, it was just different, but it wasn't worse. And yet the colonization idea was to say, well, we're going to bestow our culture onto you because ours is obviously superior. And with that kind of attitude, it's no wonder that we've had so many issues with how this has gone through time. One of the ways that I like to describe the traditional indigenous worldview is that it's through the medicine wheel, and many of you have probably heard of and experienced that before, and that provides an excellent lesson in the significance of the number 4 seasons, 4 cardinal directions, 4 sacred medicines, and so on. But I tend to take the advanced lesson to this, which is the medicine sphere provides the lessons and significance of 7. And so, like the first one where you were learning about the wheel might have been an elementary education about, medicine wheel and so on. The medicine sphere takes us a step further into understanding how our worldview looks. And with that, there's the physical with the body senses, taste, touch, smell, vestibular, the emotional aspects, love, hate, fear, confidence, sad, happy, the spiritual, which is the world of the unseen. It's energy, frequency, vibration, and all things start there first. And that's why oftentimes our ancestors and many of us now look toward prayer to be able to take us into that realm of the unseen. Then there's the mental with the truth, belief, knowledge, creativity, and reasoning. All of those aspects are part of our educational systems. Then there's the cultural which is the language, values, attitudes, stories, and geography, and our connection to the land, really. Remember that our religion started right here, where our home territories were. It's not, across the seas. This is where we believe we originated. That's where our origin stories are. It's where our religion comes from, and it's been proven that, at least for Ho-Chunk, we've been here for at least 2 ice ages, which is at least 20,000 years. So in that sense, it's one thing to say, our religion is superior or whatever. It's another to be able to carbon date it. And that's, I think, what the scientists are finally catching up to do. The next thing is the environmental, and that's something that Janil was talking earlier about with our connection with the land, the water, needing clean water. I have trouble understanding why more people don't understand what the significance of fracking or oil lines or the dangers of these types of things coming so close to our very sources on which we survive. I think one of my favorite memes on the internet is talking about how you can't drink oil, and yet water is something that we need to survive. And so environmental aspects are base in our survival. And then there's that center point, that little tiny circle in the very middle. That's the soul, and that's our everlasting energy with the creator. So for those of us who practice this traditional way, we believe that we are a soul having a human experience, and we take that human experience knowledge back to our creator at the time of our death, that transition. Next. So here's some examples of the connection. Wesley Esquimex and Smoluski said, nature was the Aboriginal people's spiritual heritage. It defined their culture, their way of life, their fundamental rights, their religious and cultural ceremonies, their patterns of survival, and above all, their identity. Also from them, they said Aboriginal communities must have their land back in order to restore a healthy attachment with their caregiver. Furthermore, the land needs to heal and will be healed through this reclamation. Some Native individuals believe that their pain is 400 years old. It's part of the land. And then Eduardo Duran talks about beyond the obvious manifestations of environmental destruction, which he calls earth wounding, Duran says that soul wounding of the land can also occur when there's a massacre of human beings on the land. With the understanding of interconnectedness, when the earth is wounded, the people who are caretakers of the earth also are wounded at a very deep soul level. Next. So our values, attitudes, and beliefs, parts of our culture were described, I guess, in this way to have these certain values. To cherish knowledge is to know wisdom. To know love is to know peace. To honor all of creation is to have respect. To face life with courage is to know bravery. To walk through life with integrity is to know honesty. Humility is to know yourself as a sacred part of creation, and truth is to know all of these things. And one of the things that Janil mentioned earlier with regards to our partnership was that the violence wasn't necessary. It wasn't a tradition for us because everybody was busy working to survive. And with that engagement, there was a partnership that was built because things were life and death. It was a very hard life. But at the same time, it was one that had meaning and purpose and intention. So with that, that was definitely built into the culture. I mean, I guess one of the things when I say scientists will have to catch up to us is understanding that the ethnographic aspects of who we are was to also have a very light carbon footprint. So that's got to be part of this conversation as well. And unfortunately, so few of us have that kind of knowledge anymore that oftentimes when you will see a Native person in your offices wherever that might be as an allied healthcare provider, you may not, or that person may not have any of this knowledge because it's been decimated right out of us generationally and intergenerationally. Next. So here's always one of my favorite slides. The Rice Center did some awesome graphics on this idea. With adverse childhood experiences, which we've all heard of, we start at that base with that level with a young person that experiences those adversities. The next level up is to have disrupted neurodevelopment based on the violence that they're witnessing or experiencing themselves. Then when they grow into teenagers, then we're looking at social, emotional, and cognitive impairment from the time that they started experiencing that violence all the way up to whatever the age is now. And then at that same point, between like 13 and 24, even up to 32, it could be arguable that there's an adoption of health risk behavior. So, smoking, drinking, the coping mechanisms that Janil had mentioned before are certainly aspects to this, because it's those are the easy ways to numb out. They're not necessarily positive, healthy coping skills. They're negative, unhealthy coping skills. The next level is when we start into the adulthood. We have extended disease planes with disability and then social problems among the population, with a high likelihood of earlier death because of it. Now, even as we're looking at COVID right now, we see that it's disproportionately impacting the American Indian population, just below the numbers for the Black population within the United States. And part of it is because of the ACEs. Another part of it is on the historical trauma. So this is for a person that experiences ACEs. And then let's go to the next slide. And the one on the right is the one that talks about the historical trauma embodiment. So you'll see that the two pyramids are similar, in terms of the one that starts with the turquoise and describing the ACEs. And then the native or indigenous person is looking at complex trauma. And then as they grow, the allostatic load, the disrupted neurological development, very similar. The coping, very similar. The burden of disease distress, very similar. Early death are, they're both markers of this. Now, the differences that you see are listed on the right side: microaggressions, implicit bias, and the epigenetics, and how our generations respond to different stimuli. The good news about when we have maladapted stimuli are that back in the day, that was a survival mechanism to a healthy brain. Now that it's come intergenerationally, it's no longer an appropriate response to what a human is feeling. So in situations like where you might find yourself hating to go to the dentist, or not wanting to speak publicly in front of thousands of people, those levels of anxiety and distress are things that perhaps an ancestor of yours might have experienced when they were facing off with death. And so the neurobiological response to that then becomes one that's maladapted. So you're feeling the same types of things and thinking, okay, I'm not sure what these 5,000 people are going to do to me, but oh my God, I'm scared out of my wits. So that becomes part of the complexity in working with people who have historical trauma. And I would argue that 100% of the indigenous population here in the United States is a product of historical trauma. We're the descendants of that 1% who survived. whatever the malady was, whatever the circumstance, and whatever the historical period was. So now you see at the base of the pyramid on the historical trauma and embodiment is trauma and social location. So there's social conditions with the local context, as well as the generational embodiment and the historical trauma. Those are the pieces that are continuous reminders. And it was interesting before we were talking, before we started the session, Jean mentioned something about, having the picture of Bascom Hill in the back for my Zoom, because I pulled a new picture up. And she says, "Oh, are you going to talk about that?" And I was like, "I don't know." Well, the moment is here, and yeah, I'm going to talk about it in the sense that looking at the statue of Abraham Lincoln isn't necessarily, the honest Abe, and let's celebrate his birthday and one of the greatest presidents of the United States. He's also a person that gave the orders for hanging 32 people, including some that were Ho-Chunk, during the Dakota hanging in December of, I believe it was 18. Well, I'm not going to guess at that. I'll have to look it up. But in doing so, he was a known Indian killer. And so to see that at the head of the university, and that's not the only experience. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of different things that happen, including, now the land acknowledgement exists, but it wasn't that long ago when the dispossession was never acknowledged. And so I guess I can speak for myself and say that affected me, and when you're trying to survive as a student on a campus, and then you have professors asking the question, well, why aren't there more Native people here? It becomes kind of a foregone response to say, are you kidding me? Yeah, all of this stuff happened even on this campus, and you don't get it. And so when we're talking about providers and their setting and looking at, what people call privileges and white privilege and that kind of thing, I'm not saying that it's about the skin color. What I'm saying is it's about the experience. And with that experience comes a lot of different ideas where a client or a patient might look at you and think, this person's not going to get it. They're not going to understand me. My mother was silenced. I've been silenced. Why should I trust this person? They give me 15 minutes and it's billable hours. And, how am I supposed to communicate all that's happened to me? And, I am grateful, personally, I am grateful for trauma-informed training that's been taking place over these past 10 years, because it has shifted the mentality from one of what's wrong with you, which tended to be the question we were asked before, to one that says, tell me your story, what's happened to you? And it's with that kind of care and relationship building that we finally hit a level of mutual understanding, or at least the potential for it. And I think that that's really significant in terms of how we're going to best address how to help advocate for Native people. Next slide.
Okay, perfect segue. So I'll have to quickly go through these so we can leave a few minutes for Q&A, hopefully. But this section, really, we want to share with you practices on trauma-informed care, and sharing what we know as providers, as myself as a nurse, and Barbara as a community healer, that highlighting that trauma-informed care really is a strength-based framework that recognizes the impacts that these traumas that we've discussed in those previous slides can have on the health and well-being of patients and clients. So it really is patient-centered or survivor-centered, and what Barbara just mentioned, it shifts the focus of what's wrong with you, why don't you do this, why don't you do that, to what happened, tell me about it. And recognizing as providers that this widespread trauma has impacts, including historical and intergenerational, and also understanding the potential paths for recovery. We can better understand signs and symptoms of trauma that may not be, what we would traditionally think of as signs or symptoms, things that may be a little more subtle, or things we may misinterpret as non-compliance. And also thinking about how we can incorporate or integrate this knowledge of trauma into policies, procedures, and practices to better provide care. And then we're always, trauma-informed care keeps us from re-traumatizing our patients or falling into those oppressive tropes of, the inadvertent things we may do, like the victim shaming or blaming and labeling or deeming people non-compliant, who are really having a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. So I'll have to move on. Continuing on this strength-based approaches, we always, as providers, want to highlight what they're doing right, focusing on the strengths and not the weaknesses or things that we may perceive as weaknesses. Emphasizing that violence is not their fault. Checking our own attitudes through practicing self-reflection, even if it's something that goes against our own beliefs. We can never project that onto the people that we serve. Like why don't you just leave? Or I can't believe you would let that happen to you, or things like that. Recognizing that our clients are going to make mistakes, and we all do because we're human. But rather we need to turn that into a strength by empowering our clients, helping create a safety plan or a plan of action, but then letting them take charge of it. And that's really practicing self-sovereignty, or that ability to self-govern. So my body, my rules. Really constantly or consistently reminding people that they're not alone, that there's hope. And really this aligns with advocacy-driven care, being their advocate, their ally, their co-conspirator, that we have their best interests at stake. This is also pretty similar to practicing culturally safe care. I'm not a fan of culturally competent care. I don't feel that any one of us could ever be competent in something that's socially constructed, but practicing culturally safe care really just means that you're creating an environment for someone that's safe. There's no denial of their identity or their needs, a place that they can feel safe spiritually, emotionally, physically, mentally. And it also keeps us from putting people in a box. So, thinking that about that local context, that there's no one practice of how to take care of a Native American tribes are different. There's different languages, different kinships, different clans systems, different languages, that we can't just assume that because someone is Native American that they think or do certain things. That we see that each person is an individual, and asking things. How can I support you? Is there anything I need to know about your cultural preferences? You know, how can I support you in your healing? Not being afraid to ask questions, because that's how we can provide the best care to people, is finding out what their goals, priorities, and needs are. Again, that what can I do? The most important things we can do are just providing that humanistic care, that respect, seeing them as a human being, and treating them with dignity and respect and without judgment. Listening attentively is such a key thing to establishing trust with survivors of violence. I can't tell you how many times I've met with women for interviews, and they repeatedly say they didn't listen to me, I'm not believed, I'm not heard. And so just listening and lending that safe ear, respecting their autonomy or sovereignty. And that means if someone is not ready to leave an abusive relationship, then we have to respect that. We cannot force our thoughts, our ideals, or opinions onto people. That's where we can help in creating a plan and letting them take the lead, and instilling that sense of autonomy, and people will learn to start to trust again when they know that we have their best interests at heart. So I think this is you, Barbara.
She needs to unmute herself. Okay. So there's also the element of traditional healing. And the best thing that I can say about this are dancing, singing, storytelling, and silence.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
Are the 4 universal healing salves. And when people aren't seeking their joy, it's sad. And that's something that I feel like a lot of Indigenous people have denied, either through external oppression or even internal oppression, being told they're not enough or not good enough or whatever. So the response needs to include joy in healing. Next slide. We also have to recognize that we live within the 21st century, and hybridizing community resilience with cultural traditions is going to be significant, where we take a look at things like the Sustainable Development Matrix by William McDonough and Michael Brongart, where they talk about the balance of planet, people, and profit. But we need to be intentional in our design, and that's their primary message. One of the things that we also need to look at is that if we build, manufacture, make, or create anything, it either needs to be biodegradable or infinitely recyclable. If it's not, it shouldn't be made. And that's something that my organization, For Her Wellness Institute, works on these concepts, along with the Children's Fire, which is our governing type of decision-making method. Next slide. One of the things that my boss, Leah Denny, talks about, she's the founder of our organization. She talks about the mental health walk. And you can see by the arrows that we start with, somebody comes to us for services with mental health, and then they walk out into the world and experience the systems and community. And with how we try to empower them is to be able to wear that armor in public and to help improve the systems and community in which they live. And so when they come back to us, it's like a next step in their growth. And we want that positive, effective systems change in the field of mental health to be very prominent in how we go about making these indigenous healing methods. Next slide. And so with that, there's also the positive systems impact spiral. As we know, things can go down the drain, and that's a negative spiral. What we want is the positives. We want the systems and community to improve, and we want the indigenous person system encounters to improve. And as the relative takes their infinity walk, we call them relatives, not clients or patients, with our services and positively impacts other places and systems that they encounter, they build a positive spiral through time, which they are operating within a positive community. Next slide. So even our workplace culture is built of the stuff that I've been talking about. We use smudge and medicine in our workplace. We hold the attitudes of giving and reciprocity as a major element of how we operate. And then we also are community driven. I can't even say also, because it works on all three of these work in tandem with each other to make the dynamic that we have. And it's really a different kind of workplace. It's extraordinarily positive and really great to work there. Next slide. One of the things that we do with our relatives is to fit in the neurobiological pieces. We tend to follow the trainings of Dr. Bruce Perry with the neurosequential model of therapeutics. And with that, we have a neurobiologically informed practice where we include a healing kit in each of the survivors' bags that's been created. It provides immediate stress reduction strategies, supports co-regulation in terms of the breathing and working to get that person out of crisis mode in their brains back into the prefrontal cortex. It offers culturally respectful teachings and includes sacred medicines, healing informed coping tools, culturally responsive materials, and victims' right and support resources. Next. This healing kit and associated support services through our organization is provided free of cost. Yes, we at Her Wellness don't believe in the idea that it should cost you to heal. And that tenet is such that, you know, we write lots and lots of grants to survive. But it's a major coup, I think, on mental health to be able to say, it shouldn't cost you to heal. And as a survivor myself, I value that. Next slide. So in our mutual work with one another, Janil and I have the extraordinary pleasure of working with Teresa Stevens. She's Menominee. She's our sexual assault advocate or community advocate that works with local hospitals and the Indian Community School and other places that have high concentration of Native American population. And she's basically on call in the evenings so that if a call comes in and there's somebody who's seeking help, then she provides those services. And as we kind of started this presentation, one of the things that struck me was I think one of our greatest success stories, which is a young woman who's been trafficked since she was 11 years old. She's now 21, and Teresa handheld her step by step from escaping the pimp's household to getting her the immediate services and care that she needed. And now she's been reunited with her son. She's now in an apartment. UW-Milwaukee has been instrumental in helping set this lady up for success. And I don't think you can get much better than that. Next slide. Go ahead.
I was just going to add that this is a effort of a academic community partnership through the Department of Justice grant that we applied for. So it provides funds to hire advocates. So it's just an exemplar of how academics and community partners can work side by side to meet the needs of the community.
And Teresa has done some amazing things, including all of these handmade bags and getting the donations and organizing all the supplies that go in them for a variety of sizes, circumstances. You know, some of them may contain, you know, things for an institution where you can't have, you know, a lighter or burning object or that type of thing. So we take those elements out of the kit and replace them with one of our other sacred medicines, tobacco, so that they can pour that for prayer. And it just, the detail that she has gone into to create these survivor bags is just amazing. And all of the items have either been, you know, Goodwill provided, they're all new, or it's definitely Teresa hustling the community because she's good. Oh my gosh, so resourceful in terms of making sure that our relatives get taken care of. Next. So her wellness also provides, and since COVID has definitely taken apart the way we operate, we've gone virtual. So we offer sensory fitness, emotional sobriety, children's book club, trauma center, trauma sensitive yoga, all these different types of things. So if you look on our Facebook page, you can see the types of programming we offer, some of the back videos, and also opportunities to heal. Next.
Janil and Barbara, this is Jeannie. We have just about 3 minutes left, and there are a couple of questions for you. So it's up to you how you want to handle that.
Oh, I see that up there.
We can just finish this out to talk about vulnerabilities, being willing to express the truth no matter what.
I'm so sorry. Oops.
No, that's
There.
okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's up to you as a practitioner to feel that vulnerability and lean into the discomfort and learn.
So we have,
If people have specific questions, we can take all of them, even if you didn't put it in the Q&A. If you want to send it to the conference presenter, or our emails are available on the handouts. We can compile questions and answer them, or we can do it individually through email. I'm always happy to touch base with people who want to learn more about this topic and discuss how, you know, you can better care for survivors of violence. So we probably have time to answer one or two of these. Let's see. Do you want to take one and I'll take one maybe?
Well, I had written a response to one that should be available in the chat for everyone.
Oh, I see.
And then Fred's got the next one, Fred Coleman, and it's problem of differing views of the nature of story, dominant culture view, law enforcement view, trauma uninformed view, tribal cultural view. If you don't know how story is used and understood, it's hard to hear someone's story. Very true.
Yes.
You know, and that's something I think that interdisciplinarily, we need to sit down and talk with each other. I think one of the more successful models has been like the drug endangered children model, where we get together as communities to be able to reconcile the different vocabulary in our fields. I mean, that's one thing that we're seeing already within the MMIW task force, is the fact that, you know, one person's police report that says homicide might be a medical examiner's report of a suicide. And how a person gets shot in the back of the head, I'm not sure how they do that to themselves. But that is something that we really have to communicate, is to get interdisciplinary. We need to communicate. We need to talk. We need to write stuff down, come to agreements, all of it, all of it. Let's see.
I was starting to type. There was the question about the perpetrators of violence and whether they're coming from outside reservations. And this is kind of complex, but to answer it straightforward, we don't know for sure what the race of every perpetrator is. It's not always collected, but the national NIJ study tells us that many, I think it was almost 86% of the perpetrators were non-native for that particular study. And this was coming from participants who were in urban and reservation-based areas. For my particular study in an urban-based area, it was about half and half. But most of the studies that we've seen, that many of the perpetrators are non-native, and that they're coming into reservation-based areas, whether they're having interpersonal relationships. Some of them they do it purposefully because they know that they may or may not be prosecuted for that. So we're getting a better understanding of that as we start to do more research, but to hopefully answer that, that's what we know, that many of the perpetrators are non-native.
This is Jeannie again. I'm sorry we're out of time, and I know that there are a few questions that remain, but we'll try to be able to get some answers to you through our conference website. So I want to thank Janil and Barbara so much for sharing their time and expertise and critically important information that they shared with all of us today. Thank you also to everyone in attendance for being a part of this event and for your commitment and efforts to confront racial injustice in every facet of your lives. So please watch for an email with a link to complete an evaluation for today's presentation. I know that both Janil and Barbara really appreciate any constructive comments that you have to share. So thank you again. We hope to see you next week, February 12th, for the part 2 of this conference. And now enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.